Okay, so why don't we go ahead and open, we've got about an hour before lunch, so why don't we go ahead and open up questions and comments from the public and from the web stream. And those would be addressed to both the recreation chapter in that review and also the cultural resources chapter. And again, we're going to talk about subsistence this afternoon, so that's not part of this discussion. But and then when we have some web questions, I'll ask those as well. So I know there were some earlier ones that I cut off, so now's the time.
Hello, I'm Kendall Barbary. I'm a master's candidate at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. I have a question, or maybe rather a comment, just pertaining to the earlier kind of recreation-based studies that I guess Kevin Waring can't actually address right now. But thinking about the statistics in terms of park visits, it was emphasized in the presentation, and I know Donna is also not here to address it, but it was emphasized in the presentation that the Lake Clark Park and Katmai Park were some of the least visited parks in Alaska. And I know that, Steve, I think you were trying to get at this point in terms of maybe that's not the best statistic or the best number to actually look at. I mean, we can look at all sorts of numbers, but maybe a more relevant set of numbers for Pebble to look at would be the days spent in the park rather than the number of visits. Because if you think about, say, visits to Denali, and I know that there's studies to back it up, and I apologize for not being able to provide a citation right now, but I'm looking for my sources, that visitors to, say, Denali, while they're very, very high, the average amount of time spent in the park is about 17 minutes. So, I mean, I think there is definitely a disconnect there in just looking at the number of visitors to a park versus the amount of time that people spend there. One other comment to address to Monty. I appreciated you bringing Karen Ivanoff's information into the report, and I know that she did additional studies this past summer, including doing some ground truthing and mapping in the Chilitna watershed, which might be interesting to also include. That's all.
Thanks.
Steve, you want to address the first one?
Well, I think your point is well taken. The EBD itself notes that that the Park Service put a caveat on its own numbers, and if you look at the table, you see that the backcountry dispersed goes from something like 20,000 to 0. There's been a lot of, shall we say, ferment in the way the Park Service measures and collects data in Southwest Alaska, and I'm proud to say that I contributed to what we hope is a new and better system. But it all points towards the validity of your comment, which is that you just have to be very careful about what you're measuring and why you're measuring it. So as an economist, I want to get to dollars pretty quickly and where they're spent and who benefits. But other people might have different uses for the data. So I'll leave it at that. I'm going to go explore for this 17-minute number. I'm not sure I believe it, but it's fascinating enough to get me going.
Very quickly, I just wanted to respond to what you just said, because I have the recreation, and if maybe you could click on it. I want to, because I think this is the statistic. I actually interpreted this differently in that it says it's the least visited parks within the national park system, and so that would be in the entire U.S. So I think that's what that says. Okay.
Can I weigh in on that real quickly? And I didn't read the chapter, so this is speculation. But visitor statistics for Alaska include cruise ships, for example, in Glacier Bay. And that's a very different experience than a person getting on a float plane going out to like Clark or whatever. So I just underscore the previous comments that you really need to look behind what these percentages are of what. And but you know, Alaska parks are difficult to get to, especially in the Northwest. And but if you decide to go, as Steve has pointed out, it's quite a logistical trail with dollars littering the way.
Okay. More questions or comments?
Sam Snyder, Alaska Conservation Foundation. A couple comments, but I can spread them out if there's others that want to ask questions as well. First, in the presentation, it was noted that the area is designated for mining. I think it's worth noting to the public and to the panel that that's based on the 2005 Bristol Bay Area Plan, which reclassified some 12 million acres out of the what I think 1983 Area Plan, 1983, 1984, and reclassified with priorities formerly at subsistence, recreation, and habitat to reclassify those 12 million acres to mining. It's also worth noting that reclassification in its definition of habitat used marine criteria such as walrus haulouts to define habitat for moose and caribou as prioritizing those habitats, and also defined recreation as not including sport fishing and hunting. So a couple of key things to keep in mind there, and most importantly that area plan was challenged and taken to the Alaska Supreme Court and is now in the process of being rewritten. DNR will be rewriting that, and then public will have a chance to comment on it. So I think that's something to keep in mind as to how we talk about these places as classified and designated for management.
So a minor correction. The 1984.
Bob, we can't hear you. Can you hold that? Yeah. Okay. Hang on to that.
Yeah, let's do it while.
Okay. Go ahead.
I expect that DNR will be going out. The 1984 for a correction along 6
Introduce
separate.
yourself, please.
My name is Bob Leffler.
Thanks.
And at one point I worked for DNR for many years, probably too many. But in any case, the 1984 plan also had classified this area for minerals. The same is the classification around Pebble didn't change in the two plans.
So, do you want to? We want to focus on the panel, but if you want to, I don't want to.
This is minor, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's a priority listing, as I best understand.
Sam.
But you were involved.
As I understand it, it was a priority listing, so a categorization and sort of priorities. But you were involved in it. But I think 12 million acres were reclassified, and those 12 million acres are being reconsidered. We should take this offline. Yeah, that's fine. But I think it's an interesting point to consider.
Are there comments or thoughts from the panel on that? Is that an acceptable observation? Okay. Let's go. I know Sam has another one, but let's keep going, and Sam can come back.
I'm Steve Burrell, former executive director of Alaska Miners for over 2 decades. The land that was referenced a little bit ago was actually selected by the state of Alaska because of its mineral potential. That's in the original records. That's the reason the state selected it. The reason it was not considered for national parks and preserves or et cetera during ANILCA was that it had that selection, number one, and number two, that it was a priority selection for the state. So this area has been well understood to have mineral potential, not a mineral deposit at that time, but having mineral potential. It's been well known since the first days of statehood. Thanks.
Okay, so in terms of the relevancy of the baseline studies would be around a designated land use that should be covered in the baseline studies, and it sounds like that's a little bit of a moving target at this point. So we can come back to that. Go ahead, Bob.
My sense is that the area plan doesn't affect the validity or changes in what they're discussing. I think he's got some good points and mostly right, but in fact, it doesn't affect this.
Okay.
That's my thoughts.
All right. Are there other questions or comments from people in the audience? And then I have one from the web.
My name is Paul Frost at Togiak. I had opportunity to talk about Pebble Mine in Geneva, Switzerland 2 years ago. There was a meeting there about uranium mining, and I was given the floor at this conference in Basel when we went to Basel from Geneva. The comments that I made, I noticed they came out with, and this is just a point of information, the General Assembly came out with a report of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I'm not going to read this whole thing. I'm just going to touch on a couple of points. The Special Rapporteur notes that there's a fundamental problem with the current model of natural resource extraction in which the plans are developed with little or no involvement of the affected indigenous community or peoples concerned, and in which the corporation is both in control and the primary beneficiary of the extractive operation. I just noted, I heard the word cultural considerations, not necessarily bandied about, but mentioned, and I have asked once before about how relevant. There's different worldviews. There's this forum where by virtue of me being present and a couple of other of us as indigenous people of Alaska sitting here might possibly constitute participating. Kind of, sort of, but we're not really participating in the sense that when the studies are done, there's no real connect with indigenous knowledge. I mean, I've got piles of documents that, but suffice it to say, I guess where I'm coming from is I have a problem with, in here, this report just came out May of 2012, but it was printed August and September, and I just received it. What the Special Rapporteur is saying is that the doctrine of discovery in its enduring impact on indigenous peoples and the right to redress for past conquests noted that it was clear that the colonial era doctrine of discovery, when coupled with the related doctrines of conquest and European racial superiority, was the driving force for atrocities committed against indigenous peoples on a global scale, with the consequences continuing to be felt. And he said that the international community expressed strong rejection of the legal doctrines and social attitudes that perpetuated discrimination and disregard for indigenous peoples and their rights. The point being, I mean, it's not just a slam, but it's just an illumination, I guess, on the fact that we are living in 2012. A lot of the procedures that are taking place still are not connecting with the indigenous people, meaning this forum isn't really taking into account or consideration the ramifications of this development, even at the preliminary stages. I know they're not out there drilling. I know this is all preliminary stuff. But the fact of the matter is all this preliminary drilling has already affected the animals and the fish, and not to the degree that it will if the mine is developed, which once they solve the problem of the energy they need to develop the mine and the corridor to get the resource out, and that, those are some couple of big hurdles. But when that happens, I mean, they are drilling for gas out here in Cook Inlet, so that, maybe they'll use the gas in Cook Inlet. But if and when the mine is developed, I'm just hoping that at some point, we are here in the 22nd century or 2012, where I would like to see a little more, not just consideration, but involvement from the indigenous perspective and worldview, and so that, because it is going to affect our, I mean, there's no doubt about it, and it won't be in a positive way. In this same report, there's about jobs, and I'm not going to read about it, but it talks about the type of jobs that extractive companies, mining companies, provide for indigenous people, and they're not, they don't even envision providing indigenous jobs like an engineer or training to be, so that you can move up the ladder. It's more of a laborer type things, and that's just the mindset that's already set from these principles from a long past. And I'm just trying to share that in hopes of encouraging just to open up everyone's kind of thinking about just including all of the people that are living on the land.
Right.
And that's all. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks. I'd like to get the panel's reactions if you have any. I think that's part of what you're talking about is addressing a mine planning process and a mine operation process. And so here we're focused on studying the existing conditions. And so I guess the question for you all is how are indigenous populations being involved in that study process? And I think this is a good question to ask this panel. So if that's I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that seems like the appropriate question for this group. So you want to say more about that? We'll get Steve, and then we'll move down.
Thank you for those comments, and my response is going to be partly or mostly a sort of a channeling of what I think Dr. Haley would want to say if she were still here, and partly, sorry, you're here. You can say it then.
You say it. I want to hear what I'm going to say.
David Yesner is such a he's such a significant presence that I didn't even see you. Okay, well, now I'm on the hook. So I think your comments underscore what Sharman said yesterday about the importance of assessing in as part of the baseline the state or the existing institutions of governance and participation and institutional capacity to respond to whatever changes may occur, be they mining or others. And so I think that is within the scope of baseline assessment, but now Sharman can correct me. And my own sort of part of the response is that while I admit that I did not comb carefully the economics chapter because I focused on recreation, it's a little unclear to me whether the involvement and the documentation of sort of basically what's going on with the native corporations in the region was adequately addressed in the baseline document. I consider them to be very important institutions, both economically, socially, and culturally, and I didn't pick it up, at least yesterday, that there was a lot of good documentation of what they're doing.
Well, I think a lot of us are very sympathetic to many aspects of the statements that you made. It's true, as Todd said, that a lot of it applies to sort of the post a baseline phase of analysis. A lot of us, however, wish that there was a Alaska Native component to the panel that's sitting up here discussing many of those things. I think that would have been very useful in terms of exchange of ideas and information. Nevertheless, I think there have been real attempts to involve people in terms of some of the things that Don's going to be talking about this afternoon in terms of subsistence and traditional ecological knowledge. And I think that, as we've been talking about, there was a real attempt to involve people in cultural resource interviews. Maybe some of that could have focused more on values and some other kinds of things as we've been talking about. But I know that Braun Associates have been involving local people, and maybe even though Steve's not a member of the panel, I would appreciate it if he could address the issue, because I know he's been involving local people as a part of his archaeological survey teams out there, and I think that's done with many of these kinds of ideas in mind. So I hope that he can address that issue as well.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for your comment. And I will reiterate that having effective local voice that can identify potential issues and problems in advance, as well as collaborate in strategies for mitigating those issues, is critical in the planning process. It's not just about the engineering of the site, of the project and the location. It's also about the policies that affect the human and social infrastructure, and the local communities are predominantly Alaska Native and actually have a plurality of interests and a plurality of cultural traditions, and it's a major challenge and a plurality of degrees of organized voice in the process. And one of the challenges going forward is finding ways to bring all the different perspectives to the table in a way that promotes some degree of cooperation in moving forward, because if the process itself is sowing conflict, that is eroding the long-term well-being of the local people.
I guess I'd like to make 2 or 3 comments. One is I really appreciate, after I give my talk today on subsistence and traditional ecological knowledge, which is in part a critique of some of the things that are missing from the baseline data, but also to recognize, as Steve will point out, that there was a real effort by Steve Braun and by ADF&G to talk to elders. There's an awful lot of TEK in the subsistence EBD, but I'll discuss that in more detail during my talk this afternoon. I think another thing that's really needed to be brought up, and it's constantly been emphasized at this forum, and that is where we are in the process. And to some extent, it's important when you collect baseline data to include the voices that you just mentioned, because if they're not included in the baseline data, then they're really not going to be addressed in the analysis of the impacts on the affected environment. So there's that. On the other hand, when the NEPA process begins, and I'm not going to give a long lecture on this, but in response to your point, I would strongly recommend that people advocate for what's called a collaborative learning NEPA process. And Meg King gives lectures on this, but and it's also being applied in the state of Alaska with Chugach Forest. And what collaborative learning says is that at the very beginning of the NEPA process, and especially before alternatives are discussed, that stakeholders, representatives, sit down with the agency that will be given responsibility for the development of the document, and we don't know who that is even yet. You know, perhaps it's EPA, perhaps it's Corps of Engineers, I don't know. But the whole point is that from a real transparency from the very beginning of the NEPA process, that stakeholders, and I would include obviously regional and local representatives of the indigenous communities and or their corporations, be part of that representation. But the whole idea is that when the agency responsible for the development of the EIS, whenever they discuss that these stakeholders are present, so that it is completely transparent. Now, it's a real, how would I put this politely? It's a real pain in the ass for the agency because there's a lot of transactional overhead, because you've got a lot of people, instead of sitting down and saying, well, let's talk about this, or let me think about what the alternatives would be, you really have a series of people discussing that issue with it. Now, the big payoff for the agency is that through these stakeholders' interaction and collaborative learning, a lot of the onus for the responsibility of what is and what isn't in the EIS is eliminated, because you've got those voices in at the very beginning. The second thing I'd recommend in terms of this NEPA process is something called adaptive management, and that is that these stakeholders be present not just when the EIS is written, but during the development and afterwards, that there be regular monitoring of what was projected in that EIS. And if whatever alternative's chosen turns out to have consequences or outcomes that weren't anticipated, that then those can be addressed, and that there be a forum and process for mitigation of those through time.
So if we could, would like to hear from Stephen and Monty on the question that was asked here. So I kind of want to stick to the baseline studies, because that's what you're all familiar with.
Thank you. This is Stephen Braun. I do appreciate your comments as well. They were well stated. And I thought a lot of them went to the planning process, of which our firm is not doing. We're doing baseline studies. And I hope you're around this afternoon, because I'm going to spend time on subsistence. And we did go to 19 communities, and Fish and Game went to 18 communities. We did interviews. We didn't do everything that could be done, but they were pretty lengthy interviews, and I'll explain that characterization this afternoon. And in that, we did bring in the local perspective. We ask at the end issues and concerns, and we document them broadly, and then also Pebble specific. And I think in my talk I only mentioned the Pebble ones, but in the EBD there's a section in each community about what are the local perspectives, what are the local issues and concerns at the time. So part of this, in terms of that baseline, I think this afternoon we'll address that more. We work with local people in those communities, as I'll explain, and in the cultural resources, we've had a pretty concentrated effort in our office. Again, much thanks to Monty's always pushing in that direction of hiring local people. And we have a young woman from Tyonek who came several years ago to catalog artifacts, and she's been both in the Pebble project and up in the North Slope, and a great field worker, and we try to involve the local people. I'll let Monty speak to that.
And I cannot speak for all of Pebble's hiring practices, but the folks who I've got to work with, specifically bear guards, are predominantly from local communities. So when we go out and do our surveys, they're out there with us. An age range goes from, I would argue, probably 18 to probably 70. And the knowledge that those folks bring is irreplaceable out there. Because whether they're 18 or 70, they grew up out there in that landscape. And so when they're out they're surveying with us, they're actually responsible for finding a number of the sites. While we're out digging our tests or something, they'll continue walking around looking for bears, but they also look at the ground and they'll locate artifacts as well. And they also help place these sites that we document within a local context. For instance, when I talked about the historic trapping site where the bear guard thought he knew whose family had traditionally used that area. And so we were able to discuss that. And this provides the stuff we find and identify in a much better context. So our work would be incomplete without the participation of our bear guards, who are generally local folks who have definitely contributed a lot. So
let me give you my response from the Keystone Center's perspective, because this is something that we talked about a little bit the other day, and I know that part of your question is around participation here. And I think so. The challenge that we faced was that we have the baseline studies to evaluate, and the baseline studies were done using Western scientific methods. Even the studies of subsistence and traditional knowledge are done to a large extent using Western scientific methods, and we may find out that that's not entirely correct on my part. So when we looked for panel members to evaluate the baseline studies, we looked for scientists who have expertise in Western scientific methods, and translating that to a broader public, including Native people, is very challenging, and I think we recognize that. And any advice that you all have about a better way to do that, I think we're entirely open to as we move forward. And if there are better ways to do it, I think we'd certainly like to hear them and figure out a way to incorporate them. So I definitely understand the challenge, and I'm glad that you raised it. So thank you. So I have another question from the web, and this is directed to Steve, and it's on recreation. The question is: it seems like trying to characterize, and this is from Nellie Williams from Trout Unlimited. It seems like trying to characterize recreation without taking into account the reasons why people choose to spend their money to visit Bristol Bay. In other words, the more qualitative information about the experience they are seeking and activities that bring them to the region results in an incomplete characterization. Do you think Pebble's data sufficiently looks at this aspect? And if not, what are your recommendations?
Good question. I'm going to try to answer it from a sort of strictly professional economist standpoint, as opposed to an Alaskan who's had the privilege of visiting the area myself. I don't think the data was available at the time the EBD was written. It was not available to be harvested as secondary data that would adequately document the extent to which people are willing to spend a lot of money to come from a long way away to visit some of these areas and partake in the associated activities. So one could say that the EBD fails to document the sort of the intensity of the demand. That's economist speak. The intensity of demand, the willingness to pay big bucks by a lot of people to enjoy these unique resources and activities. I've tried to indicate in my comments that I think we, the social science community, has made great progress in getting some of that data, and we certainly could make more progress if we had the time and resources. So I think I've already recommended, and I can, by way of responding to the question about what would I recommend, I've already recommended that I think there's some low-hanging fruit that's been generated that could be harvested to better document the economic contribution and the just even the economic value of the recreation and tourism resources in the area, and more could be collected. So I think I'll leave it at that without trying to make some kind of a statement about whether what's already in the EBD fails or doesn't fail to document that.
Okay, thanks. Okay, we've got John.
John Shively, CEO. Bevel, I'd just like to respond to the question a little bit. I mean, if you're going to get into that kind of detail and understand who the people are, you need to understand the various categories of expenditures. You cannot assume that all the people that go out there are individual people willing to spend $6,000 to $8,000. There's a huge amount of corporate money that's spent that are largely, I suspect, tax write-offs that supports that recreational lodge industry out there. And so if we're going to do that kind of thing to make the information meaningful, we have to understand all the different users.
Okay, thank you. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I would agree.
Okay. Yes.
Yes, I'm Myra Olson, and I'm a lifelong resident of Bristol Bay, and I serve on different boards and things and have been a long supporter of sustainable communities in our region. And I was wondering, well, a couple of things. Mr. Colt commented on the EBD table 2525 showing the sharp decline in the sport angler days and catch, and as well as the decline in the moose and caribou. And I was wondering if there's any correlation between the predation of bears and wolves regarding the moose and caribou to impact those numbers to help with those graphs. And also comfish, they say escapement because when the fish goes to spawn, they have to escape the commercial fishers to get close enough to where they're going to do their thing. And so I don't think that the sport fish take is factored into that in those numbers. And also the mortality that's caused by catch and release, because there is a considerable number of mortality to the salmon when they, even though they are released. And this is coming from a culture that was taught not to play with our food. And I was wondering about if there's anything done regarding the actual local numbers for who gets paid, jobs with the local communities, the guides and whatever, that should be factored in as, since this is a baseline of what's actually there, that the impact, the economic impact to the community, it should be noted that that graph that you kind of had heartburn over, I think, was closer to what's actually on the ground than the things that you were saying. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to address any of those, Steve? It sounds like some of them might be more fisheries related or wildlife related, and but if sometimes economists can answer those questions.
No, I can't answer them. I think your questions are more astute framing of my questions, which is what's behind those drop-offs in catch and angler days and moose and caribou. And I agree that it would be when you look at economic impact or economic importance of an industry, the devil is in the details of who actually benefits and where and how much. And so I would absolutely agree with you, and I think you've amplified very well what I was trying to get at in my last comment, which was, in the future, let's please consider this sector, at least in part, to be an important economic industry, and look at it that way, and maybe not get, or at least separate out that part of it and look at it right alongside other industries and apply the same kind of criteria that we would in trying to measure and understand it.
If I could ask Steve a follow-up question on this point. You basically recommended an integrated regional economic model with tourism as a major component, and you cited some tourism studies that purport to show local economic impacts, and I'm guessing that those studies were showing jobs that are local as opposed to job holders that are locally resident. So does the data exist to do the analysis of the local resident participation in wages and indirect benefits, and considering the seasonality of these industries for local participation? And if the data doesn't exist, what would it take to generate the kind of data needed to flesh out this model?
I don't think the data exists, and I don't really want to speculate on what it would take other than a lot of detailed inquiry into sort of the nuts and bolts of how the industry works.
Okay. Next question or comment, please.
Donnie Fliegel-Wiedewick. Thank you. Just being a layperson and quickly going through these PowerPoint presentations, I was having a side conversation with a few folks in the back, and I was kind of wondering, looking at the place names, that in the distant past, was there a lot more Athabascan settlements in the region than there are now? And secondly, I was just curious. Curiosity kills the cat, but satisfaction brings him back. About what the criteria is for these, quote, battle, unquote, sites. Thank you.
Well, maybe I'll speak first, and then Steve, if you want to also chime in, that there's certainly considerable linguistic and some archaeological data to support the notion of expansion of Dena'ina people in the Cook Inlet region. In general, there's considerable information that suggests that the an expansion out of sort of the Kuskokwim, upper Kuskokwim drainage, Stony River area coming into the Cook Inlet region is something that might have happened during the rough period of time between about 500 and 1500 years ago. It might have been multiple waves. I mean, there's a lot of weakness in the data. They're both archaeological, linguistic data, but there are kind of there are problems with each. So no chain is stronger than the weakest link. So even putting those data together don't necessarily completely help. But I don't think that there's any question that there's been Dena'ina expansion into the area, and how that's related to overlay with earlier peoples in the area, who necessarily those earlier peoples were. Was it exclusively Yupik people? Were there some Aleut presence in the area that may have contracted and so on at some point in time in the past, maybe before 1,000 years ago? These are all sort of, and how that might have been related to environmental change in the past, of which there's been considerable over the last couple thousand years, are sort of ongoing issues. I think, as Steve Braun said before, that there's disparate opinions among archaeologists on many of these issues. In fact, there's a common thing: scratch two archaeologists to get 3 opinions on many of these subjects. So that there are ongoing matters of debate. But clearly, the oral history information, the collection of place names, and so on really help as an effort towards getting better at those kinds of things. And also the archaeological data and understanding the dynamics of Dena'ina people moving into the area and the transformations that have occurred over the last 1,000 years or so. I think it's something I'm critically interested in from the Cook Inlet area. So the research I've been doing in the Knik area and earlier down in the Kenai River, Russian River area. But anyway, I'll let Steve put in some comments if he wants to as well.
So when we did the place names research, we didn't limit ourselves. We looked at what's out there in the general vicinity of the region, and we looked at the existing literature, we looked at reports, we found maps, we digitized maps. Bristol Bay Navy Corporation had a place names project that was online. We used that. And I think there were more Athabascan place names. There had been more research done. James Carey had done a lot of research, so I think we have more Athabascan place names than Yupik in our place name database. So it really is a product of what was available in all sources, and that's what we compiled. In terms of what constituted a battle in our oral history section, or the interviews we conducted, I wouldn't call them prolonged oral histories. They were cultural resource interviews. I'd have to go look at which ones of those were and look at the particular ones, but we had a few, I think 800 and some different possible ethnographic pieces of information on a cultural resource. So not a lot of them were battles, but there were. I'd have to go look at the specifics. I don't recall. That was several years ago, of what the battle was, but that was what we heard from the people in the community.
Yeah, and for the most part regarding the battle sites, if during the interview folks identified that as a battle site area, we generally weren't going to question it, as we were dealing with knowledgeable elders who know the area better than we do. And so if they identified it as such, I tend to believe them.
Okay. Other comments, questions?
Hello. Abe Williams. I'm with Nuna Resources. Born and raised in King Salmon, Nactic area. Steve, to talk a little bit about a comment earlier that you had made, or the topic of discussion that you had involving the EBD study and some of the data that was proposed there. I believe and I feel that it's very important to highlight and address the factors that we're looking at here in what we cited earlier when we're talking about the recreational benefits, if you will, the jobs and the benefits that come to the local communities in the region. It spills over abroad into the Park Service as well, job creation, job retention, and economic retention in the region. And you look at the fishery from a commercial standpoint, the fishery from a sports standpoint, and the government jobs that are created in the area are largely held by transit workers or transplant workers or people that don't reside in the area. And where you may not feel that you have the data or the information to provide you with the conclusion to that, fishing commercially in Bristol Bay for 25 years plus, I will tell you right now that is the case. And visiting the Park Service, 3 times a year in Katmai, that certainly is the case. And recognizing and looking at the lodges in the area, it's entirely the case. So, and I look throughout the room here, and I see faces that are residents of our region, and I'm almost certain that they would concur to exactly what I'm saying here. And I believe it's certainly the importance of this environmental baseline document is to paint the picture of the region and what's taking place in our region. And it's a snapshot in time, obviously. And I do agree in some cases where 2000 to 2005 may not be enough information, because I'm certain there are more detriments to the region that have taken place from 2000 till now. And so I really want to express the fact that I believe that it's very important to take that snapshot of the region and understand the dynamics of the certain areas in the region as well in relation to the economic opportunities that are there.
Comments, thoughts?
I think that's an excellent point, and I'm not trying to disagree with anything you say. I think maybe to try to recast what I was saying is that these assertions would be all the stronger and more credible to a wider audience if they were backed up by even a little bit of empirical data, which could have included, and this is I'm not trying to second guess the EBD again as so much as indicate ways to make further work better. Data could be as simple as talking to people like yourself. It doesn't involve necessarily getting secret job counts from the Department of Labor or something, but just talking to people who know. And I would count a person such as yourself as Exhibit A of that kind of a data source.
Following up on that, yes, expert key informants would be extremely valuable in helping to understand the structure of the regional economy and fleshing out a model. But I'm thinking about it, I think that Alaska Department of Labor might be able to do some special data runs that would be very useful in providing some empirical baseline data on this question if they were given the right analytic framework informed by these kinds of expert judgments for how to aggregate the data in useful ways.
I'd like to reply to this also. There is good primary data, representative data. The ADF&G Harvest Survey conducted by Braun and ADF&G contains variables on every individual's length of stay in the community, their ethnicity, the job that they hold or have held, or multiple jobs, the industry that they work for, the length of time, and their wages. And that's for, I don't have the number offhand right now, but that's for a majority, the vast majority of individuals residing in 17 communities with the exception of Dillingham. And that data exists right now. Now, again, between 2004 and 2008, different communities were surveyed at different times, but nevertheless, I would consider it to be the best empirical data set available. There are some drawbacks, and that is when you code for what industry they're in, occupational codes, that kind of stuff, things can get lost. But the raw data set has it.
Okay. Doesn't look like there are any other burning questions right now. So I think what we will do is wrap up this session. First of all, thank the panel members and particularly Monty for his presentation and Stephen for coming up quickly and filling in some of the gaps. And so we'll go ahead and break an hour for lunch, and then we'll come back around I think around 1 o'clock and start in with our subsistence and traditional knowledge discussion. So thank you.